They started with Tin Man, they played Ventura, Highway, Sister Golden Hair, and then they showed all the clips from, from the old days. It's 2 of the 3 same guys. Yeah. It's kind of interesting. A lot of those bands, there's like one drummer or something.
Right. They're falling out. They're still touring it.
Yeah. No, this is pretty awesome. Okay, so let's do a quick review of variable versus fixed. We'll take a look at the 2 little bits of homework I'd asked you to do, and then we will finish talking about the rest of the chapter. Can you hit the lights, Jess? Thanks. Okay, so help me remember what we're talking about when we're talking about variable versus fixed costs. We've got some, usually, units down here and dollars of cost up here. But I'm also going to expound on this a little bit. It's not always units down here. It's some sort of activity driver. Usually costs are driven by number of units, but some costs are driven by other bases, such as number of machine hours, number of kilowatt hours, number of bytes flowing through fiber optic cables. Right? So it's not always units. So what kind of cost would this be?
Variable.
How did you know that?
Because it changes based on the number of units or...
It does. It changes based on the number of units. So let's redefine variable costs. Go ahead.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. What's a variable cost?
It's something that I just read that varies in total. It stays the same per unit, but it varies in total volume. So the more units you sell, the more it costs.
The more units or the more kilowatt hours or the more machine hours. So now we're kind of moving from this, very stringent definition of volume from units to activity driver. Yep, and the other way that you know that this is a variable cost is it goes through the point of origin, which means at 0 level of activity driver, there's 0 cost, right? And that is what a variable cost is. What's this guy? And how do you know that? Stays the same, right? Irregardless of what the activity level is. So what would this be then, possibly? Doesn't cross. It is, in fact, a mixed cost. Good. Because you know that even at 0, there's some cost, so it's got to have a fixed element. But it also, the trajectory shows that the more of the driver you have, the higher the cost. So that's indicative of a mixed cost. We're going to learn today how to take a mixed cost and break it into its fixed and variable components. And the reason we have to do that is we're going to actually learn about a new format of an income statement that we use in managerial accounting. Okay? We've still got, it's going to actually, the net income is going to equal the net income from a traditional financial statement, P&L, but we're going to blow it into 2 sections, blow it up into 2 sections, fixed costs and variable costs, so that we can understand what it costs to produce our product. Okay, I think that's all I have to say about that right now. So, I'd ask you to take a look at 2-2 and 2-3. And we're classifying costs here. So on page 54, John, do you want to go ahead and read me the intro and do the first one, please?
PC work assembles custom computer components supplied by various manufacturers, of both very small and assembly shop and retail sales store are housed in a single facility. Let's roll back. Listed below are some of the costs that are incurred at the company. For each cost indicate whether it would be most likely classified as direct
Good. Clearly direct materials easy to trace to the final product. Heather?
The cost of advertising in the.
Puget?
Computer user newspaper.
Yeah, that's a selling cost. Is that an inventoriable cost or is that a period cost? Yeah, clearly that would be period. You're not going to inventory that in the cost of the product, are you? Okay, go ahead, Amanda.
The wage of employees who assemble computers from, I put direct labor.
Yeah, that's clearly direct labeled there. It's easily traceable to the final product, right? Okay.
Sales commissions paid to the company's salespeople, private services.
Selling expense, yeah. Jess?
The wages of the assembly shop supervisor. Manufacturing overhead.
That is in fact manufacturing overhead, and we also identified that, I think, on Wednesday as what? Indirect labor, right? Indirect labor. Now, let me just expound on something that I didn't really identify on Wednesday, but now that we're getting kind of wrapping our heads around this. So what about the benefits, the health care and the pension contribution and all those sorts of things that I pay on my direct laborers? Is that direct labor or is that overhead?
Labor, direct labor.
It's actually overhead.
Really? Because it's indirect.
All your payroll taxes, all your benefits, all your ancillary costs of your employees are elements of manufacturing overhead. Okay? The only thing that goes in direct labor is the actual gross wages of the direct laborers. And as we get more sophisticated or learn more about overhead, you'll see why that is so. Okay, Sammy.
6, the wages of the company's accountant and admin cost.
Yep, clearly that's administrative. Is that a period or a product cost?
Period.
Period cost. Good. John?
Depreciation on equipment used to test assembled computers before release to its customers. So depreciation would be, let's say, manufacturing overhead.
So this is a little tricky. Anything, any cost that is necessary to get the product to the point where it's actually leaving your shipping and receiving dock is a manufacturing cost, right? So depreciating equipment that you need to build it or test it or package it, that's all overhead. Anything like, say you have a fleet of cars that your salespeople drive and you depreciate those, where does that go? That's a selling cost. It goes straight to your P&L. So the fact that that equipment was used to test it before it actually leaves your shipping and receiving dock, that's indicative of the fact that it's overhead. Okay? Heather, the last one, please.
Rent on the facility in the industrial park. I really couldn't decide which one that would go on there.
So you've got, let's say, 8,500 square foot facility. They use it to manufacture. It also houses their accounting, their HR, their CEO, and their salespeople. What are you going to do? I think I would allocate it. You've got to allocate it. Same with all the utility bills that come in there. Same with the maintenance that you do on the building. You probably wouldn't do that much maintenance if you don't own it, but anything to do with that building, you're going to have to allocate it based on square footage. Part selling expense, part admin, and part manufacturing overhead. Okay? So this little exercise was intended to help us with the classifications between direct material, direct labor, and overhead, and sales and admin. I'm just going to go through these and see if you've got any questions on them. Depreciation on the salesperson's car, clearly selling expense, that's a period cost. Rent on factory equipment, clearly a product cost. Lubricants used for the machine maintenance, where does that go? What is that? It is a product cost. Where is it actually?
Indirect material.
Go ahead.
Indirect.
Indirect materials. It's a material, you need it, but it's not directly traceable to the final product, right? So it's overhead. Salaries of personnel who work in the finished goods warehouse. Again, that's that. Up to the point where you're getting ready to ship it. Oh, so they got that as a period cost.
And I put product.
I put period because it's not actually related to the actual manufacturing though. That's like, even if you were a merchandising company, you'd still have those people, right? So that's
Sure.
kind of how I decided.
Yeah, I guess we need to identify. So, we need to figure out, we need to draw this line in the sand and say anything before this point is period or product. So they manufacture, they do quality control, they package it, and then they push it to the finished goods warehouse. But they're actually saying these costs are over here, right? So, I mean, let's just make that decision and say when the goods are finished, in my mind, it was always when they were leaving the shipping and receiving dock. But they're saying this is the point where it becomes a period cost. It's finished. It may be, it's not sold yet. We don't know if there's a PO by a vendor or not for a customer or not for it. But our finished goods warehousing costs are going to be period. I mean, we know like the cost of shipping the product's going to be what?
Shipping the period.
Yeah, period. Now we're also saying from the point of leaving the facility and going to the finished goods warehouse, those costs are also going to be considered period. Is everyone okay with that? Soap and paper towels used by the factory workers at the end of a shift. That goes into what? Overhead.
Would it be indirect
I put it
materials,
under
or would it
period.
just be kind of like an?
I think it's an element of overhead, just like I was saying, all the benefits that the factory workers get go into manufacturing overhead. Supervisor salaries, that's indirect labor and is a product cost. Heat, water, and power consumed in the factory, product cost, overhead. Materials used to box the products for shipment overseas, that's a selling cost, right? Period cost. Advertising, period cost. Workers' comp for my factory employees, element of overhead. Workers' comp for my office folks, period cost. Depreciation on chairs and tables in the factory lunchroom, because it's factory workers, anything to do with factory workers, product cost. Wages of the receptionist, period. Cost of leasing the corporate jet used by the company's execs, period cost. I rent rooms at the Florida Resort for the annual sales conference, period. And the cost of packaging the company's products, product cost. Okay, the rest of the practice problems are going to be due on Wednesday. Monday's Labor Day. Right, so the rest of the practice problems, not the one that's bolded, that's what's due for points, but the rest of the practice problems that are on the syllabus are due for Wednesday. Okay, let's continue to talk then about mixed costs. I guess I'll just do that up here. So what we need to do with mixed costs is, this should look familiar to you. Y equals A. What is this?
It's a
Yes, it's the algebraic equation for a line, right? So if we're converting this algebraic equation for a line to our concepts that we're talking about here, y is our total cost plus, or our total cost equal our fixed cost plus variable cost per unit times number of units. So this is B and that is X, right? Right, so our total cost for anything, whether we're talking about utilities or rent or depreciation, is the total of the fixed component and the variable component. Some are obviously purely fixed, in which case you don't have any B or X, right? This is 0. And some are totally variable, in which case you don't have an A. A is equal to 0. But we're going to be looking today at mixed costs, so there's going to be an element of each, and we want to flush it out so that we can prepare something called a contribution margin formatted income statement. So the reason that we have to break mixed costs into the two components is we're going to learn how to prepare the whole, sort of the culmination of this chapter is having our first glimpse at this new kind of formatted income statement that we use in managerial accounting in order to make decisions about how to run our business. Okay, so let's first off put up an example of a mixed cost. And first off, I want you to identify for me how we would know this is a mixed cost. So I've got data from 3 months. And in this case, my activity driver, in other words, what drives my cost, is the number of miles that my fleet puts on in any given month. Okay. So in January, my total fleet mileage was 19,200. In February, it was 16,000. And in March, it was 29,000. And my auto cost for those 3 months was 1,022, 894, and 1,414. So my first question is, when you look at a data set like this, how do you identify what type of cost it is? And we've got 3 choices, right? We've got variable, fixed, and mixed. How can you, first off, it's pretty easy to say it's not fixed, right? Because if it was fixed, it'd be the same all 3 months. So we know it's not fixed. Can you prove to me that it's not variable? How do variable costs behave?
It goes away.
Yeah, both of those are true. They're the same per unit,
If they go up in volume.
right?
For the amount of miles we've driven.
But they remain constant per unit of activity driver, right?
Yeah.
Can you prove to me whether or not this is variable?
Yeah.
Okay, so do it. Grab your calculators. Can you prove that it's not purely variable? If it was purely variable, what would you expect to see? What would you expect to see?
Either more miles per
Go ahead.
expense, getting more expensive.
You would, but how do variable costs behave? They stay the same per unit. In this case, 1,022 divided by 19,200 miles, my cost per mile is about 0.0532, right? If I go to February and take $894 divided by 16,000 miles, that's how much it is per mile. You with me? And in March, I can see it's going to drop a ton. It drops down to 0.0488. Is that how a variable cost behaves? No. Variable costs stay the same per unit. This changed at the 3 different activity levels, didn't it? So we know it, we can eyeball it and see it's not fixed. We just proved that it's not variable. So therefore this has to be a what? A mixed cost. So now we have the challenge of breaking that mixed cost into its fixed and variable components. You guys with me? There's 3 ways to do that, to break it into the 2 components. I'm going to get rid of this because the only salient piece of this was using it to determine that it's not variable, right? And in the real world, you would know what they are because you're managing your business and you know that you have to pay a per car lease rate on a monthly basis, but then you've got stuff like gas and maintenance and oil. So you would know that. But for our little academic purposes here, you need to prove to me that what kind of cost it is. But you would know that if you were running this business. Okay, the 3 ways that we can break a mixed cost into its components is a scatter graph, the high-low method, which is really the algebraic approach, and least squares. Okay, and this is from least sophisticated to most sophisticated. So scatter graph, honestly, is just setting up your, should get that written down. Scatter graph is just plotting that data on the graph, on graph paper, and drawing a line through it and saying this is the approximation of what my cost line looks like. So for example, let's see here, 19.2. So what am I gonna have for my x-axis in the example we're working with? The, no,
Miles.
the x-axis, miles, right? And what's gonna go over here? On the y? That's actually the expense, right? So, let's see what I got here, 1960. So, these are 5,000 increments. And these are $500 increments. 500, grand, 1,500, and these are 5,000 mile increments. So the first one at 19,200 miles, probably around here, what was the cost? 1,020. I'm just plotting here. And at 16,000 miles is $894, so that's about here. Yeah? And at 29,000 miles, oh, I've got to go way out here, don't I? At 29,000 miles is 1,400. Obviously, this is just, kind of eyeballing it. So what you do with the scatter graph then is you say, how would you draw a line in a way that tries to get as close as possible to the points? Okay? And again, I'm doing this very, very eyeball-y. So you can see it's got a pretty small fixed cost component, right? A couple $100. That's probably not how it's going to end up in the algebraic method because my graphing wasn't really done very well to scale. But this is just an eyeball. That's all I'm trying to show you. Scatter graph is just like a really rough glance at it. The least squares regression method on the other end of sophistication is you use statistical analysis. Excel's got the capacity to do it. There's software packages that do least squares regression. If you've taken a stats class, if you're taking your stat 241, you probably calculated those yourself, right? But what we're going to do in here is the in-between method, which is the high-low. Okay. And I'm going to show you how that rolls. So in the high-low method, and I just was too lazy to do this for 12 months, but you would look at a data set that was comprehensive, like a year or 6 months. But I've just got 3 little months here. So the first thing you have to do is identify what was the month of the highest cost and the month of the lowest cost. So what's my high-low here?
January and March. March is the high in January.
No, February and March.
That's my high and that's my low, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yep. Okay. So what the first thing we're going to do is figure out what part of the cost is attributable to the variable component. And the way that we do that is we find the difference in the cost divided by the difference in the driver. Because that's got to be the variable component is what makes it go up based upon activity.
Why does it have to be the highest and the lowest?
It's just, you just are going to pick that up. You're just going to pick that out of the data set. If it's truly a mixed cost, the algebra is going to work the same for each point,
Yeah.
isn't it? Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
So it's just a way to.
Sorry, I was like,
no, it's okay. But it's just as a way to start
Okay.
looking at the data so everybody's using the same numbers. Okay, so the variable component is going to be the difference in the cost divided by the difference in the activity driver. Right? And that's going to equal basically our not our A, our B in our algebraic line.
Or
Huh? Oh, yeah.
that's our slope.
Thanks.
It's okay.
Didn't I put our line as A plus BX?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is what we're going to find by that formula I just did was our B,
Oh.
which is the variable cost per unit. Yeah? So the difference in the cost get me this number, please. The reason that it's higher at 29,000 miles and 16,000 miles is because a portion of the cost is variable. So we need to flesh out what that variable cost per activity driver is, and in this case it's miles. $0.04 per mile. Anybody have any idea how we're going to take that now and extract the fixed cost? And if you go back up to the equation for the line, you've got all of the variables except for one, and so you can solve for A. And you can use any of the data points to solve for A, but let's just, because we're all doing the same thing, let's use March's data. Do you understand what I'm asking you to do? Good.
Do you want us to just do it for that one?
Well, once you get the fixed cost or solve for A, you should be able to prove it by doing what? Sure, that line should work for all of your data points, so I always want you to at least prove it in one other data set. So what do we have here? Did you guys get 254? And that wasn't too far off from my scatter graph, was it?
I just checked February.
Good. I will tell you in the book, I made this problem up to illustrate this example, but in the book, they didn't make sure that the line fits all the points between the high and low. So don't get, I mean, that was just must have just been laziness or oversight or I don't know what. But so when you work problems in the book, it's only going to work on your high and low points. But in reality, the mixed cost obviously is going to work at all the points. So basically what they're saying is, you know, say I've got a couple cars, my lease payments are $254, and the cost of running my fleet is 4 cents a mile. Okay. So is everybody clear on how to do this? The key here is that you want to prove it. So of course you're going to make sure that it also works here. Right? And it does. And I think it works on my other point too, because I threw it in Excel and made sure that it worked. So the other thing I want to point out here is that when you answer this, when I ask for the variable cost component of a mixed cost, you've got to tell me per what? Because otherwise it's irrelevant. 4 cents. 4 cents what? 4 cents per mile, 4 cents per kilowatt hour, 4 cents per unit. Okay, so now we know we have to identify the activity cost driver, right? Good. Wow, you guys are catching on quickly.
Yep.
That excites me that we can.
Okay, why are we doing all this? We're doing all this cost categorization because we're going to be preparing and utilizing something called a contribution margin format income statement. And I'm going to just abbreviate that as CM, contribution margin format. Income statement. And hopefully when I put up the model, you'll be able to start to see, kind of critically analyze why this is such an important new format for us to use if we're trying to manage our business in a strategic way. Actually, you know what I think I'm going to do? Sorry. Is I'm going to put it next to our traditional income statement so you can see kind of a compare and contrast. That screw up your notes, sorry. Okay, so both of them are going to start obviously with sales. Right, sales revenue. In your traditional format statement, what comes next? Sales minus COGS. Yep. Sales minus COGS gives you something called what? Gross profit, right? Or gross margin. Then you subtract all the rest of your expenses. Operating expenses. And you get to operating income, right? And you subtract and add all of your other, right? The stuff that you do that isn't indicative of what you're in business to do, but you might have some rent revenue because you're renting out the back of your warehouse, but you're not in the business of renting. So that's not going to go into your sales, is it? It's going to go all the way down here. Plus and minus this other section called other revenues and expenses. And that brings you to your net income, right? In a contribution margin format statement, you're going to end up with the same number, obviously, net income. It's not changing your numbers, it's changing the way the data is presented so that you can use the data to make managerial decisions. So we're going to take our sales minus our variable costs to come down to our contribution margin. Now for a moment, let's just stop and reflect on why this is important. For every dollar of sales, we know that a variable costs stay the same per unit. So for every dollar of sales, my variable cost should remain static per unit, right? So the contribution margin is this number that allows us to understand what amount we have that still needs to cover what? Your fixed costs, and hopefully generate some income, right? So if we carefully manage this number, we've always got a clear snapshot of what amount we have available to cover our fixed costs and generate income. And again, these numbers are no different between the two. So when we're doing all this work up here to break our fixed and variable costs down, it's so that we're able to put it into this format, and we're going to be using this number, well, all these numbers, but particularly contribution margin in chapters 3 and 5 extensively to analyze things like, what's my break even? if I need to generate $25,000 of profit next year, how many units do I have to sell in order to do that? What if I engage in an advertising campaign that's going to cost me $2,000 a month, right? So I'm upping these guys. What's that going to do to my sales? And very easily I can see how's that going to impact my net income. What happens if I decrease my price per unit? But I think that's going to result in me selling more units. How's that going to impact my net income? We can see all of that by working with contribution margin. So I'm kind of glimpsing ahead, but I want to convince you that this is a incredibly critical tool, useful tool for managing your business. And you will generally have this contribution margin format broke out for every kind of product that you produce. You know, down to the penny, for every single monitor that I sell, what's my contribution margin on it? And how does that differ from the mouse that I sell or the keyboard that I sell? So that is about all I have as far as chapter 2 goes. I think that's the last concept that's presented. Your homework will have you working with, so we've done classifications, we'll have you working with mixed costs, it'll have you doing some analysis, algebraic analysis of lines, and it'll have you taking a look at your contribution margin format statement. Okay.
Are we gonna do any of those?
Yes.
We are, like, in the homework?
Uh,
Eventually.